Hi, AP Lang students. This is Master P, and you're joining me for another close reading video where we're going to take a look at strategies you can use to closely read specific passages from your reading. So, as you can see on the screen, today we're talking about an excerpt from In Defense of a Liberal Education by Fareed Zakaria, and let's jump right into it. So, as a reminder, when we're reading closely, it means that we're reading actively, right? And we're trying to reveal those layers of meaning, and we're trying to get at a better understanding of not only the content of a text, but also the style, the rhetoric, how a writer is making an argument and what that argument is, right? So, as always, our materials, we need our copy of The Language of Composition, 3rd edition. Definitely, we would need our key passage handouts. Highlighters are always useful, and something to write with a pen or a pencil. So, as a reminder, we always want to come back to that rhetorical situation. So, we have our rhetorical triangle. We've got our text, which is shaped by the speaker, in this case, Fareed Zakaria, our audience, and also our subject. And then all of that is surrounded by the context or shaped by the context. And that's what gives us our rhetorical situation. So before we jump into actually closely analyzing this text, we need to have a good understanding of the rhetorical situation. So this passage came from a book, as I mentioned before, In Defense of a Liberal Education. It was published in 2016. And in this book, Zakaria addresses the impact of liberal arts education on himself as an individual, and also the importance of that education to society. So the context, the factors which were shaping this book and made it so timely were the rising costs of college. College costs keep going up and up. People are suffering under a lot of debt and student loans. And so there are some real questions being discussed as to, what is the value of a college education? What is it worth? What's the purpose? Why do we go to college? And so, so those were sort of the influences that shaped Zakaria's writing of this book. And so you can see on the slide here that a lot of research has been done. People have been looking into the usefulness of major, how much do people make after they graduate college, that sort of thing. Okay, so the audience for this book, you're probably talking about educated, well-read people. Zakaria is a very, very entertaining writer, but it's nonfiction. It's, perhaps not as engaging as a Stephen King book, for example. But people who are interested in this subject, who are passionate about this subject, they're the ones who are going to pick up Zakaria's work. And he is a well-known intellectual and someone who's respected for his abilities to research and put together an argument. So, as I mentioned before, he deals with the purpose of education, value of studying liberal arts, and then he does also use a lot of his own personal experience. So go ahead and take a moment to read this passage through. Our first step is to read for understanding, just what's happening in this particular passage. So take a moment to actually read for that understanding. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to read through. And the next aspect, or the next couple of considerations that you want to think about now that you understand what the passage is about, would be, do you understand the overall features, right? Do you understand Zakaria's purpose in this particular passage? Could you describe the mood? Could you describe his tone? What is his attitude toward liberal arts education? What is his attitude toward his mom? How can you articulate those levels of meaning? And then also, what's his position in this particular moment? So take a moment to consider those elements, either write them down or discuss them with your teacher. Okay. All right. So some of the things that I wrote down are that I wrote that his purpose is to convey the influence of his mom and those materials that she brought back from America, and the influence on how it shaped Zakaria's point of view and his perspective, even before he came to America. And the larger purpose, this immediate purpose of the passage aligns with the larger purpose of the book, which is that he is trying to convince an audience of the value of a liberal arts education and the value of American universities. So this small purpose fits within his larger purpose. I said that his mood was upbeat. His tone toward these materials from Harvard are certainly sort of awestruck or inspired, and his attitude toward his mom seems very admiring. He keeps mentioning that she is stubborn, but in a positive way. So we'll look at that in the passage in just a moment. Okay, so that actually brings us to our next step. Now we want to start engaging in the text and actually annotating more than perhaps you already have. So we're looking for the things we could mark that demonstrate our understanding of the passage, the style, the argument. One of the strategies that I like to use personally and with my students is using the graphic organizer to help corral all of my thoughts. So after I annotate, I use a graphic organizer, and then that brings me one step closer to actually writing some sort of extended piece of rhetorical analysis, whether it's 2 paragraphs or an entire essay. But those are the steps I usually take to get to that point. Okay. So let's actually, before we get to our graphic organizer, we need to switch over to our passage. So this is the key passage we're looking at, and I'm going to hopefully have this pen work. Let's see if it works. It does. All right, so let's see if we can have that part work. And I'm not sure if it is. So I'm going to pause for a second and see to make sure. All right, so I think I fixed my technical difficulties. Okay, so let's take a look at this passage. And I'm also going to be looking at my handwritten notes that I did before. So we've got this reference in the beginning to the historical context, right? During the Cold War, the Indian government routinely sided. So Zakaria is showing us that he understands sort of the factors that shaped his parents' own perspective, right? And we see here, this is when he mentions his mother, who is stubbornly pro-American, right? And he contrasts her point of view with his father's point of view. And I particularly like the word needle, that his dad would not annoy, but sort of like poke fun or just make those little comments to Zakaria and his brother, because the father had a different point of view, right? So, and I think this is also interesting too, that Zakaria describes his father as having absorbed the worldview of his closest allies. It kind of reminds me of Twain's cornpone opinion, where Twain makes the point that no one has their own independent opinion, that everyone's opinion is shaped by the popular majority point of view. And this word absorb that Zakaria uses seems to imply that his father was influenced and came up with his opinion not because of his own experiences, but just because that was a popular opinion, and it just influenced the way that he thought. So then again, we come back to this contrast, right? Yet my mother remained unmoved. So this sort of image of a more positive image than stubborn, just dedicated, like a rock in her thinking, that she is completely convinced, as he says. that the United States was a land of amazing vitality and virtue. And I love that he pairs those two words. I mean, there's the alliterative effect, but also vitality meaning life and energy, and virtue meaning values and, morality, things that are good. And putting those two things together is a nice way of also supporting what he believes American universities bring to the table. And then this little statement in parentheses, which is, he uses those parentheses as a little side thought, right? A little, it's not essential to the argument, but just a little insight into his own thinking. Okay, so then we get down to the description of the pamphlet. So there's a lot of antithesis here and parallelism. Instead of a thin pamphlet containing a dry list of subjects, as one would find at Indian universities, it was a bulging volume, right? So we've got this contrast, overflowing with ideas, which is set up, again, in contrast with the dry list of subjects. The course descriptions were written like advertisements, so comparing this document, these descriptions, to advertisements. Obviously, the implication there is they have something to sell, but also that they are persuasive, that the course description is persuasive in making people want to take those courses. And I like that he describes the intellectual adventure, right? That metaphor of education as a journey, as learning as a journey. And then we come back to his personal experience, right? I read through the book. This was something that, and also connects up here where he says, for me. So he is putting this experience, he's very clearly making this about his own experience. So there's that element of ethos here, that he is an authority. He can speak to the attraction of liberal arts because he himself has experienced it. And then he says he's amazed that students didn't have to choose a major in advance. They could take poetry and physics and history and economics, right? So I love that he draws those different subjects out instead of saying poetry, physics, history, right? But that he emphasizes each of those possibilities, each of those subjects more individually by including that word "and" every single time. And then, of course, I love this last sentence, from 8,000 miles away with little knowledge and no experience. So again, we've got some of this parallelism. I was falling in love with the idea of a liberal arts education. So you've got clearly his feelings on this. He's falling in love. But I love that he saves that part of the sentence. He saves his emotion for the end of this sentence, because by emphasizing that he's 8,000 miles away, and it's emphasized because it's at the beginning of the sentence, right? So the beginning of the sentence, he's emphasizing that he's 8,000 miles away. He then emphasizes he has little knowledge and no experience, and then there's sort of like this unspoken "and yet," right? He was falling in love, and then that makes us think, okay, he has this experience. When he comes to America, and where does this go, right? Where do we go from here? But he's established his ethos at that moment. So those are the things that I notice when I read through and I'm looking for style and rhetoric and understanding. So let's come back to here with our graphic organizer. So I want to try and capture what I've annotated. So I'm going to look at the quotation. I want to put it into my own words so I really understand what it is that Zakaria is saying. I want to look at the rhetorical strategy or style element, and then I want to get at the effect or the function, right? Okay, so the quotation I selected was, instead of a thin pamphlet containing a dry list of subjects, as one would find at Indian universities, it was a bulging volume overflowing with ideas. So that's just one quotation I wanted to talk about with you all. Obviously, there's much more here we can get into, any of those things that we just annotated. So putting it into my own words, I said Indian universities provide students with a boring list of classes, while Harvard provides interesting course descriptions for a wide range of classes. So your paraphrase version may be different slightly, but we're getting at the same idea. Okay, so the strategies I noticed, antithesis, parallelism, and imagery. And the way that I worded the effector function was that a clear comparison is drawn between Indian universities and American universities like Harvard. Okay, so that's the effect. And now in the next step is where I really want to get at the function of these strategies and this quotation. So I'm going to take this information and I want to put it into some sort of, I call them an analysis nugget. It's 2 to 3 sentences where I incorporate all of this information and I make sure that I connect it to the function. So here's what I wrote. Zakaria's admiration for American universities is clear. He describes the Harvard course manual as a bulging volume overflowing with ideas, which stands in stark contrast to the thin pamphlet containing a dry list of subjects from Indian universities. The parallelism sets the two up for comparison, while the imagery suggests that the mind would grow at Harvard, watered with a flow of ideas, as opposed to the dry desert of courses offered in India. Okay, so let's look at what I've done here. I make a statement about his tone, right? His admiration for American universities. So that's where I'm showing that I understand the overall feature, okay? And then to kind of support how that tone is developed, I get at what he does. He describes a Harvard course, and I incorporate the most important part of that quotation, right? Or I should say the most important point for my purposes here. And I describe the effect. It stands in stark contrast. I use some more of the quotation. And then I also, in the next sentence, get to the technique that's being used and why it's being used. The parallelism is being used for comparison. Imagery technique is being used why? Suggests that the mind would grow at Harvard, which gets back to the admiration, right? As opposed to the dry desert of courses. So that is my rhetorical analysis. Try this, do this with other elements within this passage. There's so much here. Zakaria is such an amazing writer. And then once you do all of this, you would be ready to answer a prompt such as this. In a well-written essay, analyze the rhetorical strategies Zakaria uses to convey his attitude toward a liberal arts education. And you could just nail that. You would be like, I got it. No big deal. As you work, we say good luck to you. Fare thee well. From all of us, the team for the Language of Composition 3rd edition, good luck. And